Streams and rivers are some of the most beautiful natural ecosystems that we come into contact with. But these same systems are very delicate and can easily be disrupted by human activities. Aquatic systems are impacted by inputs from their surroundings. For example, as a forest goes through its annual cycle, it can affect the stream environment by contributing water from storm runoff and spring thaw, soil from erosion during storms, and organic matter from decaying plants, animal excrement, and dead animals. Small amounts of organic matter are healthy for the stream and supply nutrients for primary growth in the stream. These nutrients are the basis for most food chains in an aquatic system.
When nutrient levels in a stream reach a certain level, growth forms on rocks and tends to make them slimy. In this process, nature is taking dissolved organic matter from the water and turning it into particulate or solid organic matter in the form of bacterial, algal, and fungal cells. This is the same natural process that we use in sewage treatment plants to process our common household waste. The problem is that if we directly release our sewage waste into streams and rivers, it causes two problems. First, the organic matter is at such a high level that it overwhelms the natural removal processes in the stream. And second, disease organisms present in our waste are transmitted to other users downstream from our sewage release. Before we can completely understand sewage treatment, we must define a few terms and see how the effectiveness of the sewage treatment plant is measured. Every sewage treatment plant measures several chemical parameters of what comes into the plant, referred to as the influent, and what leaves the plant, referred to as its effluent. From the standpoint of day-to-day operations, it's important to know how much waste is entering the plant. This information helps the plant operator keep the plant operating at its maximum efficiency. From a regulation standpoint, it is important to know how well the treatment plant has removed the organic and bacterial waste. Examples of these chemical measurements include a solids determination, a biochemical oxygen demand test, and a fecal coliform test.
One of the most important chemical measurements is the dissolved oxygen concentration. Air-breathing animals have the luxury of having approximately 20% oxygen in the atmosphere. But water can only contain about 8 to 10 parts per million depending on the temperature and amount of organic waste in the water. In percentage terms, water only contains about 0.001%, which is incredibly small as compared to our 20% from the atmosphere. When organic waste is released into a water system, microbes in the water use the dissolved oxygen to oxidize the organic waste. You can see that when there are only 10 parts per million oxygen in the water, all of the oxygen can be rapidly consumed. Thus, the main point of a sewage treatment plant is to remove the organic matter to a level that the stream can handle the waste. That is, such that it does not consume all of the oxygen. This brings us to the term biochemical oxygen demand, referred to as BOD. The BOD is a measure of how much oxygen would be needed by bacteria to completely oxidize the waste. This is determined by placing a small amount of the organic waste in a bottle, measuring the initial dissolved oxygen in the bottle, allowing it to incubate in the dark for 5 days, and measuring the remaining dissolved oxygen. From the initial and final dissolved oxygen measurements, you can calculate the BOD in the waste. Sewage treatment plants measure the influent BOD and the effluent BOD to determine the percent removal or efficiency of the plant.
Waste treatment plants vary from city to city, but the basic processes are the same in developed countries. In fact, one prerequisite for being a developed country is to have adequate water and wastewater treatment. These two capabilities are key to fighting disease and providing one's citizens with a healthy environment. We will illustrate a trickling filter plant and an activated sludge lagoon. First, we will follow the water through the plant. Then we will come back and discuss solids removal. As you view this video, remember that there are two types of BOD that we are concerned with. BOD in the particulate or solid form, and BOD dissolved in the water. It is also important to note that we remove dissolved BOD by turning it into microbial cells that we can then remove from the water. Prior to the 1960s, most cities in the United States only performed primary treatment on sewage waste. This basically involved collecting the flow from the sewer into a large tank and letting the solids settle out of the system. The cleaner water flowed over the top of the tank and was released into a nearby stream, but this water still contained approximately 50% of the initial BOD. Solids collected in the bottom of the tank were disposed of in a landfill. As you can guess, this may have been an inexpensive treatment process, but it was not as effective as we needed and did little to control diseases.
In the mid-1960s and 1970s, the federal government started a program to update sewage treatment facilities. This basically involved adding secondary or biological treatment to existing facilities and building completely new facilities for cities without any sewage treatment. After the biological treatment process, another settling tank was added and a chlorination step was added to kill any pathogenic organisms still present in the waste. This brings us to the major goals of sewage treatment. These goals include the removal of solid waste that can result in BOD to the receiving water. We must also remove any dissolved BOD, since this form of BOD will travel with the water, exit the plant, and result in harm to nearby streams. From a purely visual standpoint, we also want to remove any cloudiness or turbidity from the water. Removal of pathogens is a major goal of the treatment process. And finally, we would like to remove any noxious odors from the waste.
The sewage treatment plant that we will use to illustrate wastewater treatment is located in Walla Walla, Washington. This plant was selected due to its proximity to Whitman College and because of the diversity of treatment processes that the plant has. We will begin our tour by looking at the location of the plant with respect to the city of Walla Walla. The usual location of municipal treatment plants is downhill from the city. Drinking water plants are usually located uphill from town, which minimizes costs associated with the pumping of treated water. The same economic principles apply to waste treatment plants, which are usually located downhill from the town. This follows the basic principle of water flows downhill. Imagine not going to the bathroom or taking a shower for a day. Or imagine not being allowed to go to the bathroom on holiday, or after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Our point here is the water treatment plants and the sewage treatment plants must operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 365 days a year. No exceptions. Some systems are automated today, but still the treatment process must continue, uninterrupted. So when you get up in the night to relieve yourself, remember, someone is hard at work at the treatment plant. The figure here shows the daily system of water use in a typical city.
Now with this background, we will finally illustrate and describe the basic components of a sewage treatment plant. As we do this, keep 2 points in mind. First, we will describe one basic system, but will show 2 different biological treatment processes. Seldom does one treatment plant have both biological treatment processes. Second, we will first follow the flow of water through the treatment plant, then we will come back to the inlet of the plant and explain what happens to the solids entering the plant. Water enters the plant through a bar screen that removes large objects that may have inadvertently entered the system. These objects would damage pumps and other components of the treatment plant and would likely clog pipes if they were not removed.
Next, the wastewater passes through a small screen which removes additional large solids such as plastics, cigarette butts, and other solids that will not biodegrade in the treatment plant, but could also damage pumps or clog smaller pipes in the system. Periodically, the microscreen cycles through a cleaning stage which removes solids from the filter. Some treatment plants have an additional comminutor which grinds the solids into smaller pieces. An example of these solids is shown here. These solids do not enter the plant any further, but are disposed of in a sanitary landfill. After larger solids that could damage the system have been removed, the wastewater flows into a settling tank, referred to as a primary or preliminary clarifier. It is important to remember that BOD enters the plant as solids, which are easily removed and treated, and as dissolved BOD, which is more difficult to remove but relatively easy to treat. Approximately 50% of the BOD entering sewage treatment plants is removed in the primary clarifier. Water enters the clarifier in the center. As the water flows to the sides of the tank where it is collected, solids settle to the bottom while oils and fats, referred to as scum, are collected by the rotating arm and are added to the solid waste. To understand how the clarifier works, we will identify the components of an empty clarifier. The wastewater enters the clarifier in the center, just below the surface but inside the center well. The baffles shown here allow the water to gently enter the clarifier and do not allow the water to rapidly leave the center well. These baffles and center well enhance the settling of solids to the bottom. In the previous video, you observed the operation of the scum collector along the surface of the water. This is shown here in the empty clarifier. As solids are collected on the bottom of the clarifier, a solids rake moves in unison with the scum collector and drags the settled solids to the center of the tank for collection. An animation of a clarifier will help illustrate its operation.
First note the turbid water entering the center of the tank. As solids settle to the bottom, the rotating rake draws them toward the center. The tank also has a conical bottom, which aids in solids collection. As solids collect in the center, they exit through the floor and are pumped to the solids digester that we will discuss later. Also note the rotating arm at the surface of the water that collects oils and floating debris. These solids are also added to the solids digester. As you have seen, there's a lot at work underneath the surface of a clarifier. The important point to remember is that the primary clarifier removes solid BOD that constitutes approximately 50% of the BOD entering the treatment plant. The remainder of the BOD is removed in the biological treatment unit shown next.
The trickling filter tank shown here is not in use, but we will use it to identify the important parts. First, the water enters in the center of the tank and flows outward along the arms shown here. The arms rotate and spray the wastewater on the rocks that fill the tank. The rocks shown here are very clean and do not contain any microbial growth. You will notice a distinct difference in the next video of an active trickling filter. First, we should note that the trickling filter is located downhill from the primary clarifier. This again minimizes pumping costs, and the rotating arms are actually powered by the water pressure from the clarifier. Also, note the darker color of the rocks indicating microbial growth. The spraying of the water serves two purposes. First, it aerates the water to allow for aerobic growth. Second, it evenly distributes the water across the trickling filter. As you can imagine, there's a lot going on underneath the surface of the trickling filter, and we will use animations to illustrate these processes.
Before we view the entire trickling filter, we will first look at the chemical reactions and biological growth on an individual rock. The growth you saw on the active trickling filter did not occur overnight. In fact, It takes around 30 days to establish a stable productive microbial growth on these rocks. But the term stable is used in a relative sense because microbial mats of growth are constantly being released and growing back. The animation here also illustrates the chemical reactions taking place on each microbial mat. As water is sprayed on the clean rock, growth starts, and it is initially all aerobic growth. This means only oxygen-using microbes are actively growing. In this case, the microbial mat is thin, which allows nutrients in the waste and oxygen to migrate all the way to the rock, and it also allows microbial waste products such as carbon dioxide to exit the system. As the microbial mat grows, it eventually becomes so thick that oxygen cannot make it all the way to the rock. Initially, a facultative area is created, which means that a small amount of oxygen makes it all the way in. This change in oxygen concentration allows a new group of microorganisms to establish a colony. As the mat grows even thicker, an anaerobic zone, which is an area without oxygen, is created next to the rock. Eventually the mat becomes so thick and heavy that it falls off and a new mat is started. But remember, this is the goal of sewage treatment systems, to turn dissolved BOD into microbial cells that we can easily separate from the water. The microbial colonies released from the trickling filter are easily collected in another clarifier, and clear, clean water is the result. Now that we have seen what happens on each rock in the trickling filter, let's take a look at the entire system.
To understand exactly how a trickling filter works, we must look at a cross-section of the tank. As you can see, trickling filter tanks are circular in shape, which allows the spinning application arms to evenly spread the wastewater across the entire bed of rocks. Water enters the tank through the center pipe and flows outward along the arms as it is sprayed onto the bed. The water flows downward through the bed of rocks. BOD is drawn into the microbial mats, and the treated water is collected in the bottom of the tank. The treated water, and any microbial mats that have been released, travel next to the clarifier, where the solids are allowed to settle out. The trickling filter was used as the biological treatment in wastewater plants for decades. It served its purpose well, but suffered from a few limitations, and a more stable system, the activated sludge lagoon, was developed. The limitations of the trickling filters are: they are susceptible to shock loads of toxic chemicals. For example, many sewage treatment plants today also serve food processing plants and industrial processes. If one of these plants accidentally releases toxins to the system, it will kill most or all of the microbial colonies in the trickling filter. Without these microbial colonies, the treatment plant is essentially shut down and the sewage would flow directly into the receiving streams. Although trickling filter plants are reasonably effective at removing dissolved BOD, the newer activated sludge lagoons are more effective. Finally, in cold climates, the trickling filter unit must be covered to avoid freezing in the winter months. Settling properties of the solids leaving the trickling filter are not as good as solids from the activated sludge process. Now we will look to the alternative to the trickling filter, which is the activated sludge lagoon.
Activated sludge lagoons come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Most are rectangular, but more recent ones are semicircular in shape and divided into two units. The system that we will show is in the City of Walla Walla treatment plant. The right side of the lagoon is where extra or recycled microbial cells are conditioned and microbe selection occurs. We'll look at a close-up of this tank in a moment. As more microbial cells are needed, they are added to the left side of the system, which is vigorously mixed. This is where dissolved BOD is taken up by the microbial cells and turned into cell mass and more microbial cells. Now let's look at the activated sludge lagoon a little closer. We are looking at an empty holding tank which is also referred to as the starving tank. This is where extra or recycled microbes from the second half of the activated sludge lagoon are stored until needed. These microbes are stored in high numbers in a thick cell suspension. First, notice the mixer blade in the middle of the tank. Now, we'll look at the full tank. The cells are mixed and gently aerated to just keep them alive. The simple fact is, these microbes are starving. We have found that if we keep these microbes really hungry, when we mix them with fresh wastewater and mix them vigorously in the second half of the activated sludge lagoon, they rapidly take up the dissolved BOD from the water. The point of this is that the wastewater only needs to spend a short time in the second part of the system to remove the dissolved BOD.
The second part of the tank shown here is divided into two identical cells. Both are violently mixed with the blue blades shown in the middle of the tank and by the white aerator that is just visible underneath the concrete slab. As you can see, this half of the tank is well mixed in order to supply lots of oxygen to the microbes. Unlike the trickling filter unit, this is a completely aerobic process. The cells must stay suspended and be supplied with the needed oxygen to take up as much of the BOD in the short time. As new cells and fresh wastewater enter the system is mixed and circulated. The hungry microbes rapidly take up the dissolved BOD and incorporate it into their systems. As the turbulent mixture passes the exit, a small portion of the liquid is removed and sent to the clarifier, shown here in the background.
Now, we will return to the basic system. Remember that usually only a trickling filter or an activated sludge lagoon are used for the biological treatment unit. Rarely does one treatment plant have and use both units. After the biological treatment, a clarifier is needed to allow the solids, which are actually microbial cells, to settle. The tank shown here is identical to the one we saw for the primary clarifier. The only difference is that the clarifiers positioned after the biological treatment unit are larger than the one used for the primary clarifier. The larger size here is needed because the particles that we are trying to separate from the water are smaller and require a longer retention time in the tank to settle and produce clear water. Again, let's identify the important parts. As in the primary clarifier, we have two rotating arms, one along the surface of the water to isolate and collect any floating solids, and one along the bottom to direct the settled solids to the center of the tank for collection. The water from the biological unit enters the center of the tank. The baffles allow the water to gently enter, and the center well keeps the water from rushing to the exit weirs positioned along the outer wall. The large hole in the bottom of the tank is where the settled solids exit. These solids are now referred to as sludge. Let's look again at a full tank. Microbes entering the tank have just received a large helping of food. Yes, food. It is difficult to think of it, but our wastewater is someone else's food. At this point, the surface of the microbe changes and allows them to stick together. This is good for us, since larger particles will settle faster. Unfortunately, they do not settle quite fast enough, and we use two settling basins, one after the other, to allow most of the microbes to settle out. Solids collected in both clarifiers are sent back to the holding tank in the activated sludge lagoon, or are processed as solid waste discussed later. Water exiting the second clarifier is very clear, but not quite clear enough to exit the plant. To clarify the water a bit further, we use a filter bed. This final set is referred to as polishing the water.
Although the water exiting the clarifiers is considerably clear, most treatment plants are required to filter their treated water prior to releasing it to a stream. The most economical way to filter large volumes of water is with the sand filter bed. Some plants use sand as the filter medium, while others use fine coal. Even others use a mixture of sand and coal. The dark surface of the one shown here is obviously coal. The purpose of using fine-grained sand and coal is to remove the very small microbial particles that may escape the clarifiers. Water exiting the clarifier enters the filter bed via ports in the side of the center wall. The water surface rises until the pressure of the water pushes the water near the filter bed downward. Particles in the water are filtered out based on size or by impaction onto a grain of sand or coal. Water exiting the sand filter is very clear and meets state and federal standards for treated water quality. However, filter beds cannot operate indefinitely. They need to be cleaned from time to time.
As seen here, water enters an individual filter unit from the surface. The water, containing particles, passes through the filter bed, leaving its particles behind, and clear water exits the bed. However, as more and more particles are collected by the bed, the water level and pressure increases and would continue to increase until the bed overflowed. To prevent the overflowing, individual filter units are periodically washed to remove the collected particles. This process is referred to as backwashing. The name is explained by the way the filter bed is cleaned. The water flow is reversed in the system, and clean water is pumped from the bottom to the top of the filter. The surface of the filter bed, which contains the majority of the particles, is also agitated. This washing process dislodges trapped particles which are washed out of the system. Wash water is placed back in the plant for treatment. The filter bed is usually the final treatment process for turbidity in wastewater plants. The combination of these processes produces clear water that has minimal BOD and very few pathogen organisms. The few remaining microbial organisms are treated with a disinfectant before the water exits the plant.
There are a number of disinfection techniques used to treat wastewater effluent. These include ozone, that is primarily used in Europe, but is being considered for use in the United States. Other options include high-intensity UV light, chlorine gas, and sodium hypochlorite. High-intensity UV light is a relatively new development, and with the combination of ozone, will probably replace chlorine-based disinfection approaches in the near future. But for now, most wastewater treatment plants use some form of chlorine. Chlorine gas is relatively dangerous to store and use, but is relatively easy to use to treat wastewater. We will illustrate the generation of hypochlorite by an electrolytic process. On-site generation of your disinfectant eliminates the need to transport and store dangerous gases, but provides you with a more than adequate treatment system. The system shown here uses electricity to transform a simple sodium chloride solution, which is basically a table salt solution, into hydrogen gas and hypochlorite. Hypochlorite, the ClO- shown on the screen, is the same disinfection agent obtained when you use chlorine gas or any chlorine-based disinfectant. In small doses, this compound is relatively harmless to humans, but is very effective in killing microbes. Prior to the release of the water to a stream, most states require that any excess oxidized chlorine compounds be treated to make them harmless to wildlife in the stream. This can easily be done using sodium bisulfate or sulfur dioxide gas that renders the hypochlorite harmless.
So, we've covered a lot of material. Before we go on to the removal and treatment of solids in the wastewater facility, let's quickly review the flow of water through the system. Water enters the plant through a series of screens that remove large objects from the wastewater that could damage components of the treatment plant. Next, solids are separated from the water in a primary clarifier. The solids removed here typically account for 50% of the BOD in the system. The water exiting the primary clarifier next enters a biological treatment unit. This can be a trickling filter or an activated sludge lagoon. Again, the purpose of the biological treatment unit is to convert dissolved BOD into microbial cells that can be separated out in the next step. Water exiting the biological treatment unit goes to a series of clarifiers where the solids are collected and clean water goes to the filtration unit. Here, the final solids remaining in the water are removed. Finally, the water is treated with a disinfectant to kill any pathogens that may remain in the water.
We will now look at where biodegradable solids are collected in the system, using the same figure used in the previous explanation. The first solids come from the primary clarifier near the inlet of the plant. Next, solids are generated in both biological treatment systems and are collected in the two clarifiers located just after them. Most of the solids collected from the activated sludge lagoon are recycled back into the holding tank. Occasionally, some of these solids are sent to the solids treatment. All of the solids just mentioned have been processed very efficiently, and further processing would yield very noxious odors. Thus, we now process these solids in the anaerobic digester shown here. This allows the microbial solids to be degraded into organic acids and then into methane. The anaerobic digester is simple to operate, and we basically let nature take its own course of action. A new set of microbes take the rich and healthy microbes from the solids collection and digest them further. The top of these tanks is usually designed to expand to account for volume changes without letting in large amounts of atmospheric gases. Digestion times in the anaerobic digester are typically 1 to 2 months, which is much longer than the few hours of retention time of water in the treatment plant.
Gases generated in the anaerobic digester are collected out of the top of the digester and stored in a holding tank. These gases are used to heat the anaerobic digester and pumped back through the anaerobic system to keep the digesters mixed. The reason for heating the digesters is simple. Warming the microbes allows them to digest the solids faster and shortens the detention time in the anaerobic digester. And the faster the digestion time, the smaller the volume that the tank needs to be. Plus, we eliminate noxious odors in the form of hydrogen sulfide and methane. After the solids have been digested to completion, they are ready for processing and disposal. First, they are sent to a holding tank where they are mixed. The solids still contain considerable water, and there is no need to transplant the additional weight of the water. So, a process called dewatering is used to remove as much of the water as possible. To aid in this process, a polymer is mixed with the solids to make the solids clump together. Solids are then pumped onto a belt press. Solids are spread evenly across the conveyor belt. As they pass along the belt, they are separated into windrows and slowly turned over. As we will see later, this process allows water to flow downward through the belt and leave the solids behind. The remaining solids are then placed between two belts and passed across a set of rollers to squeeze out more water. As you can see, considerable volumes of water are removed from the waste, which greatly decreases the cost of transporting and disposing of these solids.
What exits the belt press is a much drier solid waste, which is easier to dispose of. A variety of disposal options are now available. Some waste treatment plants compost their waste and give it away to greenhouses or local residents. At the city of Walla Walla, we give our solid waste to local farmers who spread the organic and nutrient-rich waste onto their fields to improve crop yields. One of our greatest environmental success stories is the removal of sewage waste from streams and lakes. This has been accomplished by the same tools nature uses, but we've incorporated them into confined and highly controlled engineered systems. Again, to repeat our goals, they were to: first, remove dissolved and solid BOD from the water; second, remove pathogens from our wastewater; and third, reduce noxious odors from the waste.
To illustrate the overwhelming success of sewage treatment plants, we will look at the dissolved oxygen levels in a stream if it were to receive the untreated sewage waste from the city of Walla Walla. As you view this, remember that natural streams, such as this one, normally have high levels of dissolved oxygen. Typical oxygen levels range from 8 to 12 milligrams per liter, depending on the temperature of the water. As you see, at the point of sewage addition to the stream, the oxygen level plummets to 0 and remains at 0 for the life of the stream. This would devastate aquatic life in the stream. Now, let's look at the effect of putting in a sewage treatment plant such as we have in Walla Walla. The incoming waste to the plant contains around 150 milligrams per liter of BOD, but the exiting water from the plant typically contains around 1 milligram per liter of BOD. Notice the improvement in the dissolved oxygen levels. In fact, water exiting the treatment plant contains less BOD than is present in the natural stream. Another point not made in these plots is the reduction of disease organisms that would most certainly be present if the wastewater was not treated. Clearly, sewage treatment plants are well worth the tax dollars spent to build and maintain them.